You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is...
Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm super excited to have Crispin Boyer back on the show with me. He was with us a couple of years ago when his first book in the Zeus the Mighty series came out. Today, he's back to talk about Book 4 in the series, Zeus the Mighty, The Epic Escape from the Underworld. This book is so much fun. The whole series is so much fun, Crispin. I love it so much, and I love what you're doing with it. Welcome back to the show.
Oh, thanks so much. Thanks for having me. It's great to catch up with you and talk, see where we come with this series.
Absolutely. So when we talked last, I was looking back this morning, and it looks like we talked in 2019, and little did any of us know, at that time when we were talking that the world was just gonna, completely turn upside down since then. So, one thing I've really enjoyed talking with authors about is, how has the time of, lockdowns and pandemics affected you as a writer? Because, for the most part, we writers spend most of our time kind of, in an office by ourselves or in a spare bedroom or something. And, so the pandemic wouldn't appear to have a whole lot of effect on our day-to-day life, but it's interesting when the rest of society kind of starts working the same way you do. How has it affected you?
Yeah, you and I, we've been working from home since way before it was cool.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, when we last talked, we were just such optimistic, sweet summer children. The pandemic, it can really turn your personal life topsy-turvy. As your friends and colleagues and family, you're worried about them, and it can certainly be distracting. My spouse and I, whenever I'd written the first book, we were living in California, and we bought a house in Hawaii. And that's one of the nice things about being a writer is really I can work from anywhere with I need a laptop and an internet connection. So it's pretty low overhead. I've written books literally just and commuting with my wife driving in the passenger seat. I've been in the passenger seat of the car. I've for road trips, I'll sit there and write. So we can really just write anywhere. And so, we've lived in rural. We lived in Mexico, along the Caribbean, and it's nice to be able to have inspiring scenery and just, it's the kind of thing that nourishes your soul and just, it helps you relax and bring out. So you can really just when you sit down to write, you can really just concentrate and sometimes like you said, you're just sitting in a room staring at the wall, and that's fine too. And so we were living in California, and we had bought a house in Hawaii. That's where we wanted to move to and have a farm. And we bought the house closed on the house before the pandemic. And then the pandemic hit, and we realized that if we didn't drop everything and move now, we might get stuck in California while there was all these lockdowns and everything. So we basically scurried and moved at the last minute and got here to this house and that's where we've really been able to hunker down during the pandemic. And it's lucky for me, we're fortunate. It's, we have a little farm, we've got a bunch of animals. So I was able to be, once again, living in a nice, inspiring, peaceful place to write. And, and I had the Zeus series that now book 4. And it's interesting, like how did the ordeal of going through a pandemic affect the writing and the characters? And I hopefully not at all. Like hopefully, the stories is just as characters. They're books for middle school kids. They're supposed to be fun. They're escapism. They retell Greek myths in a fun, silly wrapper of animals at a pet rescue center. So they're supposed to be delightful, middle school fiction, and they should be an escape from the realities of the world. And I think that being able to live here and have my bubble has helped. And I imagine a lot of writers need to find it's already, to be a writer, you need to find a bubble. You need to find a place to be and try and be free of distractions. I know there's apps on your computer that actually just are a screen that you write in, turn off all notifications, all any opportunity to jump in and check your social media. And in that way, maybe the bubble has been a little bit harder to maintain through a pandemic, but you got to do it. you got to be able to focus and meet the deadlines and deliver content that I always say the first draft is always terrible, and that's fine. It's done, and just going to go through revisions and work from there. So yeah, that's, I guess, kind of a long-winded way of saying how the pandemic affected my process.
Well, if you have to be locked down at home, being locked down at home in Hawaii is kind of the best of all worlds, I guess.
I'm not gonna. Yes, yeah, I'm lucky.
Yeah, absolutely. So we talked about the Zeus the Mighty series. The book 4 is out now, the epic escape from the underworld, and there you kind of alluded to that these are fun escapism books for middle graders, but they're based on, and we touched on this a little bit last time, they're based on the myths that have been handed down, generations, thousands of years, really, when you really look at it. What is it about these stories, these myths, that have had such lasting power, that really still stick with people, and that we want to retell them and repackage them with new interesting characters and things like you've done with Zeus the Mighty? What is it about these stories that have lasted the test of time?
Yeah, I think because this was one of the first fiction series from National Geographic Kids, they wanted to still have an educational element. So there's that aspect to it, where these are stories that are based, each book in the series is based on a different myth. So they're stories based on Greek mythology, and then that's like an avenue to study and learn about ancient Greece. So there's some geography aspects to it as well, and then kind of overall history of how ancient Greeks viewed the world, and how mortal characters were kind of heroes. So there's that element, but then the stories themselves, like you said, these started as oral stories that before they were written down, people in the city-states of ancient Greece the storytellers would tell stories of the gods and the mortal characters that are in the stories. And by the time these stories were finally written down, with Homer and the Odyssey, and everyone knew who these characters were. It's kind of like comic books. Like, people generally can go and see an Avengers movie, but they know who the characters are from just the rich mythology. And even at this point, I grew up reading comic books. You don't have to be a comic book geek to know who Batman is. It's kind of the same thing. Like, these stories have been around so long and ingrained so long in the culture that you kind of know who Zeus is, Hercules or Achilles is. When I was a kid, I would see Clash of the Titans or Jason the Argonauts movies, and I didn't at the time know that this is based on Greek mythology. I just liked it because it was cool stories with monsters and magical items, and that's pretty timeless stuff. It's the hero's journey, the mortal hero that's defying the odds and battling the supernatural. It really does not go out of style, and that's the same thing with these stories. You've got these, it's already, you're talking about animals in a pet rescue center who all think they're Greek gods, and so that kind of does stretch the boundaries of believability. They can all talk to each other. It's a dog and a cat and a hamster and a fish. They can all talk and communicate with each other. They can understand the human owner of the pet rescue center, but the human owner can't understand them. These are the kind of rules that are set up in things like the movies Toy Story and that kind of stuff. But it's a way to take to take like this fresh approach and retell these stories, hit all the main parts from the myths that really the core elements that are just part of storytelling and drama. And if kids read it and they don't even know it's based on mythology, that's great, as long as it's a fun story and it captures their interest.
So book 1 in the series, Zeus the Mighty, The Quest for the Golden Fleas, is obviously a pun on the Golden Fleece. Book 2, The Maze of the Menacing Minotaur. Book 3, The Trials of Hairy-Clees, haha. And now book 4, The Epic Escape from the Underworld. How do you choose which mythological story you're going to tackle next?
Well, that's when we first set out to do the series. We just knew we wanted each book to hit a different myth. It's funny, when you're reading the titles, I realized the puns in the titles is not consistent. But what I'm going to say is that it's every other book will have a pun in the title. That's my new rule. So books 2 and 4 have no puns in the title. So yeah, we knew there's the I guess, you see Led Zeppelin, you want to hear Stairway to Heaven, there's certain standard, certain hits of Greek mythology that you've got it covered. So there's monsters like the Minotaur, or there's the Odyssey, or the Golden Fleece. And so we knew that each book would focus on a different myth, and we kind of outlined what are the myths that are most adaptable to a kid's book. And there was, in terms of an overarching storyline, we knew we just wanted the characters to kind of grow and count on each other in new ways and learn things about each other, because ultimately the hero is Zeus, who's a little hamster, and he thinks he's Zeus, the king of the gods. So he's got a big ego. He tends to not take well to anyone usurping his authority, and generally goes off on these half-cocked plans, and it's up to the other Olympians to kind of save him from his worst impulses. So that's always going to happen. Zeus will never become he's always going to be an idiot. So let's just say that this is like one of the rules. It's like part of the story. It's in the Bible for the series. Like, this is Zeus. This is how he is. He's kind of like Michael Scott from The Office. Kind of got a decent heart, but he's not too smart. And as the series goes on, we know we wanted to expand their realm and show other parts of Greek mythology. So in this book, we explore the underworld, and that becomes part of the challenge. Is these are animals that ostensibly are all living in a pet shop in Athens, Greece. So how then do you add, say, a brand new realm? And in past books, I've expanded so they go out into the backyard of the pet center, and then out there's all kinds of other things that could stand in as monsters and other characters. So in this book, the underworld is actually the crawl space underneath the pet rescue center. And crawl spaces in general, pretty creepy places. You right. Go down, fix a leak, or do anything. They're not pleasant places. But the one thing I learned too, working on this book, is the underworld isn't necessarily. It's not like hell, or it's not like some classic terrible place. It's actually described in mythology as being, kind of has an eerie beauty to it, and it's trippy and wild, and not even necessarily a bad place. It's just the next place that ancient Greeks believed they would go after they passed on from this realm. So it's not necessarily a bad place. So when I wanted to convey that too. I did want to make an element of being kind of scary and creepy, because kids love that, but at the same time, it's not like a lake of fire or something.
Right. The character of Zeus, but you alluded to this a minute ago, that he's kind of he's this character that has good intentions but doesn't always he's constantly getting in trouble, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And what does having a character like that give you as the writer, as opposed to the actual Zeus, who is a literal god? Having a character who kind of thinks of himself that way kind of opens up a lot of possibilities. What does that do for you as a writer?
Definitely. And I learned this when I wrote the first book. is that, you kind of look at the elements of a story, and you want a good protagonist and you want a good antagonist. And for the first story, there wasn't necessarily an antagonist, but you can take a character like Zeus, and he could be his own worst enemy, and that he gets in the way of himself and causes his own problems. So that's like one very handy thing, is you can make the character the hero, but also the villain, because he like can screw things up for everybody, and then through a process of a little bit of self-growth and cooperation with his companions, he can overcome the villain of the story, which is his own his own bad instincts. And that's what's good, because it's not always easy to come up, aside from there's monsters that are in mythology, it's not always easy to come up with like a villain for the series. And even in this book, we have Hades, who's the ruler of the underworld, but he isn't necessarily a bad guy. He's just got his jurisdiction, which is the underworld, and Zeus being what he thinks is the god of everything. Already Zeus doesn't like Poseidon, because Poseidon is a pufferfish who rules the seas, which is the aquarium section. And already Zeus doesn't like this guy, because Zeus likes to think he's the head honcho of everything. So now he's running into another, and in mythology itself, Poseidon, Zeus, and Hades are actually all related. Everyone's a brother. It doesn't carry through to this, but it's that way that the villains don't necessarily have to be mustache twirling bad guys wearing black hats. They can just be rivals to Zeus, and then that helps. And that way that kind of helps create the drama, because then they're going about their lives as they live out these myths and encountering these other monsters, but while also dealing with these complex interactions with each other. And it's just, it's all pretty easy for kids to identify with. Like, of course, Zeus would have a big ego. He's Zeus. And of course, he would butt heads with Hades or with Poseidon. And that's half the fun then, to see how they get along and can resolve their issues. And then on top of that, you've got to throw in a few magic items, like an invisibility helmet, and you've got pretty good ingredients for a story.
Right. Things We Never Got Over, the new book by best-selling author Lucy Score. Bearded bad boy barber Knox refers to live his life the way he takes his coffee, alone, unless you count his basset hound Waylon. Knox doesn't tolerate drama, even when it comes in the form of a stranded runaway bride. Naomi wasn't just running away from her wedding. She was riding to the rescue of her estranged twin to Knockemout, Virginia, a rough-around-the-edges town where disputes are settled the old-fashioned way, with fist and beer, usually in that order. Too bad for Naomi, her evil twin hasn't changed at all. After helping herself to Naomi's car and cash, Tina leaves her with something unexpected, the niece Naomi didn't know she had. Now she's stuck in town with no car, no job, no plan, and no home, with an 11-year-old going on 30 to take care of. There's a reason Knox doesn't do complications or high-maintenance women, especially not the romantic ones. But since Naomi's life imploded right in front of him, the least he can do is help her out of her jam. And just as soon as she stops getting into new trouble, he can leave her alone and get back to his peaceful, solitary life. At least that's the plan until the trouble turns to real danger. Things We Never Got Over, the new book by best-selling author Lucy Score. An Innocent Client, the first book in the Joe Dillard legal thriller series. A preacher is found brutally murdered in a Tennessee motel room. A beautiful, mysterious young girl is accused. In this best-selling debut, criminal defense lawyer Joe Dillard has become jaded over the years as he's tried to balance his career against his conscience. Savvy but cynical, Dillard wants to quit doing criminal defense, but he can't resist the chance to represent someone who might actually be innocent. His drug-addicted sister has just been released from prison, and his mother is succumbing to Alzheimer's, but Dillard's commitment to the case never wavers despite the personal troubles and professional demands that threaten to destroy him. Chosen by BookBub readers as one of the top 100 crime novels of all time, get started on this great series with An Innocent Client, where it all started. Read for free with Kindle Unlimited or buy it in paperback or audiobook. An Innocent Client by Scott Pratt.
One of the best things about this book series that I love so much is the cast of characters that you've created along with Zeus. How important is it to you to have a strong supporting cast?
I think it's really important, especially because the other characters they all had a certain element to it. And Zeus, the first Zeus book was my first fiction book. I've been writing nonfiction for a long time. And I think with that book, before it got printed, I made a rookie mistake and I added in too many characters. I was like, well, there's 12 Olympian gods and goddesses from mythology. So I had, like, I'd say another 3 Olympians that were all in the mix with Zeus. And then, National Geographic, they took the manuscript and they partnered me with an editor of children's books, and she said, "Oh, this is good, but it's too complicated. There's too many characters. It's hard to keep track. You're losing each character's personality is getting lost, and it's just too much." So that's when in the first book, then it quickly pared it down to what we determined was a reasonable amount of characters that can serve different aspects of helping Zeus get out of different scrapes, have different personalities, and in a way they are kind of like, these characters are like superheroes or the X-Men. They each have their own abilities and powers. You've got Athena, who's the goddess of wisdom, is really smart and kind of the peacemaker of the group. You've got Poseidon, the pufferfish, who whenever he's traveling with the animals, he's in this little dive helmet that's connected to the tanks, and he's like a very logical character. And then you've got Zeus's best friend, Demeter, who's a grasshopper, and then you got Ares, who's a pug, and that's the god of war, and he's just this little ball of chaos who just charges into stuff without thinking about it. And so that seemed like a good mix for the first book. And honestly, at first I thought, okay, maybe every book I can introduce a new Olympian god, and it took actually till book 3 where I did introduce another character that I introduced Hermes, who's a hen chicken. And actually, she's based on one of the chickens that I have here at the farm, which is fun. But and now I feel like this is a solid team. Like, I don't really need to. If I introduce anyone else to the team, it's hard. These books are about 24,000 words each, so it's not huge amount of in real estate, and also they have to be illustrated. And I think this is a good amount of characters to balance everything out and keep track of. And also add like different elements. They kind of act as Zeus's conscience. They can influence him in different ways. And I mean they're the real narrative engine of this whole thing, and that they can if Zeus needs to be rescued, they can team up and rescue him. If Zeus needs like some insight or some help, they can help influence him. They need to team up against a villain, they can all team up. And generally they all have, and they're all funny characters. Like, there's a lot of opportunity for comedy, which is the other big part of the series. It's got to be like funny and engaging. So yeah, to have a pufferfish rolling around in a dive helmet attached to a dive tank, and just itself lead to some silly situation.
Crispin, let's talk about your writing process just a little bit. I know that before you started writing this series, like you said, you wrote nonfiction, and now these books are based loosely on Greek mythology. There's a thread of the story that we're familiar with, but you add in characters that obviously were not in those original myths, and you retell them. So there's a lot of creativity that goes into the retelling of these stories, even though they may be loosely based on something that we're familiar with. When you approach the story, are you a detailed planner? Do you lay out a skeleton of the book ahead of time before you start drafting, or are you the kind of writer that maybe sets some goalpost and then just kind of sees where the creativity takes him?
No, I'm pretty detail oriented. I'll come up with an outline for each story. I'll research the myth and see what the highlights are. So, say like in the Golden Fleas, I know that there's a Jason, and he goes on a quest for the Golden Fleece, and there's a dragon that guards it, and there's these characters that help him. And So I know that the basic milestones that I have to hit, the landmarks of these stories. I'll come up with an outline, and then I will work with my editor, and we will refine it, and then we will send it to National Geographic. Has an expert on Greek mythology who will then vet it, look through it, and say, this is an opportunity you're missing here to add this magical item, or this character, or this particular character might act this way. And sometimes I want to, because I am trying to cram a lot into a small amount of words, really, that we definitely condense stuff, and maybe we'll take some characters from another story. But she'll kind of help me get the story within the guardrails of the myth, and then we're good. I'll take it, write the story in a couple of months, write the first draft, and then I'll send it off back to the once we've gone through a few revisions for pacing and character voice and that kind of thing, we'll send it back to the expert in mythology, and she'll take one last look and say, okay, this is great. Or if she says something is way off, we'll figure out a way to repair that issue, or adapt her feedback into it. So it's pretty. I mean, now that I just actually finished the 5th book and turned it in for illustration. It's down to a pretty well-oiled machine in terms of the process, in terms of the outline, then revisions to the outline, then they'll go through the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th drafts, sometimes a 5th draft, and then send it one more time for vetting, and then it's ready for copy edit and illustrations. And that's even when it's at the illustrator, this guy Andy Elkerton does some really awesome illustrations, and he might, we collaborate, and he'll interpret the scenes in certain ways. And sometimes I'll look at what he's done and be like, well, that actually looks better than what I wrote. So I might actually ask for some tweaks and come in and tweak it to better match his illustration, or we'll both work together to make it match his illustration. So, at a certain point, you just got to be done. And the more you tweak and mess with stuff, the more chance you have of introducing errors. So you start to get past all the safety nets of copy editors and that kind of thing. So we definitely have a cutoff point. But yeah, that's pretty much the process, pretty regimented. And I'd say that's true for all of my nonfiction projects. But that said, in the revision process too, there would be a point where the editor would be like, well, this kind of drags here, or this is a plot hole, or this doesn't make sense. So there's definitely a couple of the books I've introduced some basically little set piece action sequences, just because I don't want things to drag. I just want the stories to be pretty, engaging the whole way through. And the chapters are pretty short, so a young reader can sit down and read a chapter in a few minutes, and then ideally they'd be like, well, okay, one more chapter. Next thing you know, they've finished the book.
Wow. I'll bet the collaborative nature of working with an illustrator, that has to be a really interesting dynamic. And I think that's something that most fiction writers don't get to experience. And I guess it would be easy to kind of be territorial, like, how dare you interpret this? This was not my vision. But if you have a good relationship with your illustrator, I bet that could be really freeing and bring things into the creative process that you wouldn't normally get to experience.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, that's the way I see it. It just enriches the whole process. There's certainly some back and forth where the biggest issue is consistency. That's the only thing, where there might be a character that, say, halfway through the book is wearing a certain magical charm, so they have to be drawn with that charm through the first half of the book, and then making sure then that it's removed at the right point, or is transferred to another character at the right point. There's consistency things are the only, and it's not even a bad thing. It's just something that you got to pay extra close attention to, because the readers will. But yeah, it's like when I was a kid and I'd read a book and then they would make a movie. Suddenly, then, if I read the book again, I would see the actors' faces portraying the characters in the book, and that's kind of how it is now. Ever since I've started working with Andy, that's how I see the characters, is his illustrations, because we had some basic descriptions, but he really brought them to life, like down to the little tufts in the ears of Athena the cat, and just the expressions that Zeus makes, and it's a lot of fun to really see him come to life. And then the other aspect to it that's interesting is, they take these books and turn them into audiobooks, and they have different, basically, voice actors that read the books and do the voices for the characters, and that's cool too. Then to hear the dialogue read by and interpreted by a voice actor. So that's another, and that's something I'm really not involved with at all. I just, the day it comes out, I listen to it, and I'm like, oh, that's cool. I like I like the voice he's doing there for Poseidon.
Absolutely. I love audiobooks, and I couldn't do everything that I do if it weren't for audiobooks. And you're right, they bring such a new element to the story. It's so fun to hear the story come alive in someone's interpretation.
Oh yeah, no, I agree.
Yeah.
Plus, you can suddenly, go for a walk. Go for
Exactly.
a jog. Busy. You can put it on in the car. If 20 years ago, you try and read a book in the car, it probably wouldn't end very well.
Zeus the Mighty, the epic escape from the underworld, is available everywhere now. When you're hearing this, go grab it. We're going to have links to it in the show notes of the episode, or go grab it from your local bookstore. You can find it everywhere. Crispin, if people are just discovering you and want to dig into this amazing series, and then follow along for everything that you're up to, where can they connect with you online?
Well, really, the best place is just ZeusTheMighty.com. The series has inspired a podcast, so they can find links to the podcast. And there's some games that readers can play, and just lots of introductory snippets and stories, comics about the characters, and they can even learn more about Greek mythology there. Otherwise, you go to Amazon and put in my name and see everything else I've written for National Geographic Kids. But really, ZeusTheMighty.com is probably the best place to start.
Fantastic. We'll link that up in the show notes as well to make it easy for folks to find all that stuff going on. Crispin, we're going to send everyone to pick up a copy of Zeus the Mighty, the epic escape from the underworld. Thank you so much for taking time to come back on the show.
Oh, thank you as always. It's a pleasure, Hank. It's fascinating to catch up.
Now stay tuned for an audiobook excerpt from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
Hedwig slipped into David's den, the circular reading room. A ladder of crude rungs protruded from the wall, remnant of its days as a grain silo. He pulled himself upward, rung by rung, until the bookcases and sofas were far below. Even if he fell and died, he didn't really care anymore. No, he did care. He couldn't die yet. She had to die first. That would make their divorce final, if she wanted it so much. Darkness enveloped him. He reached the top of the ladder and stepped off onto a catwalk of black mesh, lit only by the faint light of the 4 square windows that encircled the turret. From this perch he could see the exit she would use. He felt like an assassin, like Lee Harvey Oswald in the window of the Texas schoolbook depository. But he wouldn't use a rifle. No, rifles leave evidence. Rifles can be produced in court. Rifles can miss. He pulled back a shroud of burlap and opened the cardboard box he'd stashed up here earlier that day. He reached into it and withdrew the only murder weapon, the only magic bullet a Van Brunt could ever need. The gold lantern flashed in the moonlight. He held it up to the window. 1 if by land, 2 if by sea, he thought, and then it's time for a midnight ride. But it won't be Paul Revere. No, not Paul Revere at all. He found the oyster knife at last. He lay his cupped palm sideways over the vent. Don't get blood on your Armani. And stabbed the blade into his palm. The blood came hot. He dripped it into the lantern, where the skull of the horseman waited to sip it like nectar. The reliquary glowed, and an incantation in Old Dutch appeared, shining from within the metal. It was time. Hedwig bent and whispered into the vents. Rise, headless, and ride. The letters vanished, and a cold white light burst from the thing. The skull wasn't just a skull anymore. It had gestated. Capillaries clung to it the way fine hair clings to the crown of a newborn. A thick, carotid artery moved with snake-like undulation, drinking blood from the pool at the base, pulling it upwards to circulate through scarlet vessels, through twisting coils, slurping the liquid greedily, the way little Zeph used to slurp strawberry Nesquik through a crazy straw. The blood pulsed and pushed into the nose, into the eyes, into the hollow cavity within the skull. But was it hollow still? Hedwig didn't think so. He felt a mind growing there, something with a will to challenge his own. He fixed his gaze to the twin caverns of its eye sockets, speaking slowly and deliberately. Jessica Bridge. The death's head grin broadened somehow, and a thread of black and green liquid, shiny as a horsefly's wings, trickled from the gap of a missing eye tooth. Only Jessica Bridge. Do you understand? He shook the lantern. Do you understand? The face lurched forward and struck the glass, leaving a red splash there. It wobbled and settled, smiling and nodding. Jessica Bridge, hissed the face. Yes. Hedwig raised the lantern a little. Jessica Bridge. The red face tipped backwards and the jaw cracked wide. Hedwig recoiled. Something pink and wet writhed inside that mouth. The nub of a new tongue, salivating as if it could taste the name. Jessica Bridge. Jessica Bridge. Jessica Bridge. Jessica Bridge.